Welcome to a dialogue between David Simpson and David Chickey of Radius Books on behalf of Charlotte Jackson Fine Art and Art Santa Fe Presents.
So David Simpson has been both a revered teacher at Berkeley and an artist both in the US and Europe since the 1950s, with some very early success in the 60s, most relevantly a show at MoMA in 1963, as well as inclusion in a famous show curated by Clement Greenberg called Post-Painterly Abstraction at LA County Museum of Art. Up until now, the present day, David's paintings have always challenged the very basic form of painting and the possibilities of pure abstract expression. Since 1990, he has painted mostly monochromatic works that hover in a very alchemical realm, using interference paints in a process that I hope we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. David creates these very nuanced mercurial paintings. And while very minimal, David often balks at the word minimal. I think he refers to himself as an essentialist as opposed to a minimalist, which I think really does very accurately get to the heart of his work and what he's trying to do. And the results, as you can see, transcend the very notion of paintings, and I think they play very importantly with the medium of light itself. So I thought we'd maybe start with some questions about those early times. And I'm thinking particularly about that show with Clement Greenberg, and I'm curious as to how you were included in that show, if you spent time with Greenberg, and the evolution of that. That show included some really amazing other artists as well: Morris Lewis, Kenneth Nolan, Ellsworth Kelly, to name a few.
Oddly enough, I never saw that show. No. Nor did I see the Americans in 1963 that Dorothy Miller did, that I was in her last American series for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I was a poor teacher at the time and couldn't afford it. I did meet Clement Greenberg, however, and spent a day with him in New York, which was quite wonderful. I thought he was a brilliant man. I know a lot of people revile him now, and that the idea of formal criticism is not as popular any longer as it used to be, but I learned a lot from him. And one of the wonderful things about it is that poor little me from the Berkeley area, he took me around to galleries and had access to back rooms that I never would have been able to see in the world with his entree. And so he introduced me to a lot of artists' work that I didn't know. He was extremely opinionated. I found that I said a lot of things he disagreed with. And one funny thing is I saw a Barnett Newman painting in his West Side apartment. And I met Barnett Newman later that night after some opening parties from the galleries, and he was standing on a street corner. Is it McSorley's bar where a lot of the people there met? At any rate, he was very short. God, about this 3.5 feet high seemed like, but with a very large, intelligent head. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Newman, I was delighted to meet you. I just saw a wonderful painting of yours in Clement Greenberg's bathroom." I just blurted it out without realizing what I was saying. And I was almost cut in half right here with lasers from his eyes. At any rate, those shows, I always felt like Zelig in Woody Allen's movie. I was always in shows, but I was always in the supporting cast. I was rarely mentioned in reviews, and when I was, it was the usual kind of East Coast bias against the Westerner.
Well, you were one of the only West Coast.
Pardon?
You were one of the only West Coast artists.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Both.
I was the only West Coast artist in Dorothy Miller's show. And John Kennedy, the New York Times critic at the time, said it's a shame that such a horrible artist is giving a career boost this way.
He's not around anymore, I don't think.
No,
to
he's
see
not
you.
around
Yeah,
anymore.
exactly.
And Barbara Rose reviewed that exhibit, and she writes now, or used to, for Vanity Fair. I don't know, I don't pay any attention anymore. And she started out by saying, David Simpson, a Western artist who apparently likes sunsets. Like, what? Who doesn't? Maybe being in New York, she never saw one.
It's possible. So I'd like to talk a little bit about those early influences.
About what?
Those early influences. Some of the artists that were particularly influential to your work, I think even then, even early on, because you've talked pretty eloquently about going farther back into the history of art, into Impressionism, or as far back as illuminated manuscripts, or artists like that. But could we go down this road a little bit of talking about...
How far back do you want me to go?
As far back as you want to go.
Well, in school, I was a little late in school because I was in the Navy at the end of World War II, and luckily had the GI Bill. When I came out, I had the opportunity to study with some people I would not otherwise have been able to. One of them was an instructor at Pasadena City College named Leonard Edmondson, who introduced me to a kind of abstract vocabulary that was new to me. And so my work, aside from his influence around that time, would have been from people like Paul Klee, children's art, somewhat later my own daughter's development as children's art interested me. And that lasted probably until about 1956 or 58, when I graduated finally from the schools in San Francisco area and left the Bay Area and went to near Sacramento to teach. Up until that time, I was involved with some names that you might remember. Wally Hedrick I had known since I was 15 years old or 14 years old. He was married to Jay DeFeo, and we were, the 6 of us, including Wally and I and 4 other people whom you probably would not have heard of, started the Six Gallery, where Allen Ginsberg read Howl for the first time. The Six Gallery is now remembered mostly for that, not for the art that was there, but we were trying. And it was at a time when there were not very many galleries in San Francisco, 2, maybe 3 at the most. So it was a kind of an attempt on, we who were students on the GI Bill at the art school to get some excitement going, and it was mostly, the excitement mostly consisted of openings with lots of wine. And we all chipped in $6 a month to pay the rent for this space. The Six Gallery on Fillmore Street. It was owned, it had been an automobile repair shop, and it was owned by the business next door, which was a bar, which was handy. You want to go on from there?
Hard to know exactly where to go from there. So there's a conversation that you did several years ago, and there was a quote mentioned from Philip Guston that I thought was really interesting, that he said that a painting can only be judged as how it answers to 2 questions. What is it, and where is it? And I think that ties into this very interesting concept of your work as objects and relating to the environment that they're in, and how they are activated by what I think we refer to as the Simpson walk or the Simpson dance, where you have to move around the pieces to engage with them. So let's maybe talk a little bit about your...
What is it and where is it?
What is it and where is it?
You've inadvertently touched upon a pet peeve of mine. Those are good questions, and I will address them. But often the first question I get from people, and I caution you all, is, would you say something about your process? And I say no, because that's irrelevant. Besides, I'm not trying to teach you how to do what I do. The question is why and what. And the what is the most important part of it. The where implies that where you see it influences what you see. And that's, of course, true. And here in this wonderful space, the light is terrific, and it's going to affect the way you see the work. And in this particular kind of painting, if you come back 3 or 4 times, you're going to be seeing a different exhibit. The paint colors will shift because of the interference properties. But that's, again, not something I don't want to get into the chemical analysis of the paint and why it does that and so on. That's irrelevant. I have a friend an artist, friend, I don't know. When asked what his paintings are about, he says they're about perception. And I always think when he says this, well, that's fine, but that's only half the equation. It's how what you perceive affects you, which is what the meaning of the work is. And if the work doesn't affect you at all, it means nothing. If the work it can affect you in 100 different ways, and all of you will be affected in sitting in this room in different ways, and that's what it means to you. There's been an awful confusion over the years between recognition of subject matter and what the painting means to you. So this is an entirely subjective thing that's out of my control. It's up to you to respond or not. And that's fine. I'm not a dictator. I don't want to dictate how people see things. So the location does matter. It always comes as a surprise to me to see the paintings when they're out of my studio and in some other environment. They're entirely different. I have a gallery in San Francisco, and I've often gone in there and seen a painting on the wall and said, whose is that? And it's mine. You know, it comes as a shock, sometimes demoralizing, sometimes encouraging.
But your work hasn't always been that mercurial or that hard to define. No. So maybe talk a little bit about the evolution of that process. How did you go from being a painter that was very influenced and interested in children's drawings, and some of his early abstract paintings have this naive kind of quality. They're very active. They're more in.
Well, at my age, I first exhibited in 1948 when I was 20. And at my age, having reached this, I won't call it plateau, I've gone through at least 6 different periods, I guess you would say, with transitions in between. And I've often thought and said a few times that if you took a slide or a photograph of every single painting you ever did and made an animated film strip out of it, it would be seamless. One thing would morph into another, and you'd see this the way the development went. And I've been prolific in the sense that I don't do preliminary sketches. I get an idea and I do it. And so I at one point wound up with so many paintings I destroyed a couple of hundred of them. Some I wish I hadn't now, but I had no storage space. I ran out of rack space. So these 6 periods with transitions would go roughly from this school period with pictographic, abstract, children's art-related work to, and this is hard to swallow because you don't see the transition, when I moved to my first teaching job up in the Sacramento Valley away from the Bay Area. Everything was flat there, and the skies were tremendous, and the paintings turned into abstract landscapes that you could relate to Indian blankets, perhaps, or Indian madras, East Indian madras. or just the American tradition of landscape, which is a very strong tradition in this country. It's the development of our own native styles. And they were the ones that I think first attracted Clement Greenberg, because there were washes and glazes. They were abstract, but they had reference to fog, sky, and my titles even had to do with landscape and so on. And then I made the mistake of being caught up with the New York influence. I was teaching at that time and looking at art magazines all the time to see what was influencing my students, and I was trapped in my own device. I started painting hard edge stripes, and they became less natural, although abstract, and more minimally abstract, which is both good and bad. And I did a whole series of very large arc-shaped, rainbow-shaped paintings that were related to Kenneth Noland and Frank Stella and people like that, color field painting and so on, that I look back on now only as having learned not to do that kind of thing again. I would not.
They're nice paintings.
I know. Some people think they're fine.
I mean, they're still really nice paintings, by the way.
Even so, I don't refute them. I don't refute anything that I've done. I can't. I learn from them. I'm often disappointed in what I do, but and often am thrilled with what I do. I'll mention something in a minute. But these large paintings I would exhibit, but they're not my favorite period. And I mentioned sometimes being knocked out by my own work, and I sometimes finish a painting, and this happened earlier with earlier periods, not just this. At the end of the day, I often paint flat on sawhorses for a variety of reasons, and then when they're close to the end, I put them up on the wall to see what I've done. And sometimes, at the end of a long day, I'll put a painting up on the wall, and it will bring me to tears. And I go to bed happy, and I come down in the morning and look at them, and I say, "What in the hell were you thinking?" One can fool oneself only so long. From the arcs and the rainbow kind of things, that morphed in ways I can't even describe. It's so complicated, into a period that lasted, at least a decade, where I was turning Mark Rothko inside out. It was a geometric relational abstraction related to Mondrian and the Russian avant-garde. I got caught up in the whole idea of early 20th century avant-garde, which still thrills me. That period is just such amazing, so amazing. And the Cubists, beginning with the analytical Cubists, it changed the world. It changed the way we see the world, and the way the world changed the artist. It was reciprocal. And what I did was place blocks of color and bands right around the edge of the painting instead of in the center. I wanted to keep the center open, and my idea was to invent space. The landscapes that I've been doing earlier and traditional American landscape painting was getting all filled up, and you could see from the 19th century the luminous how well into the 20th century you get cityscapes instead of landscapes, and overpopulation began to be seen in the paintings. And so I wanted to create space and get all of that stuff out of the way so that you had room to breathe again in aesthetic terms. And so all of these shapes around the edge were like pushing Rothko's fuzzy-edged, wonderful, beautiful, cloudy shapes, where he pushed the background out to the edge with these cloudy shapes. I was doing the opposite. I was pushing the shapes out to the edge. But they were hard-edged geometric and rigorously composed and painted, and with different finishes. Some of the little squares or large squares would be matte, some shiny, some in between, And I would always try and bracket the ground color, which I painted like a watercolor wash. I had a floor-to-ceiling easel, and the paintings were this size, some of them. And with a big house painting brush like this, or whitewashing a fence, I would start with thin down paint at the top and do a watercolor wash all the way down. Here I'm getting into the process again, all the way down to the bottom.
I didn't ask you about that.
I know. And then while it was still wet, I would get behind the painting and turn it so that the paint would run in different directions. And I would do this 30 and 40 times, and that would give you a ground that was matte and even, and I likened it to the idea of a dense fog pressed up against a window pane. Had that kind of look, but they were in colors. And then I would place these shapes around the edge and tape them off with warm and cool, dark and light, and so that the space was moving around like this, and your eye would be like a billiard ball bouncing off the sides of the painting, going back and forth, looking at these little shapes and so on. And then that morphed into a series of just vertical stripes with some other kinds of shapes and so on. But it was around the end of when that vein of ore ran out that I started using the iridescent paints for some of these shapes. But it was very quickly obvious that mixing shapes of conventional pigment with these iridescent pigments was a mistake. That's like, it turned into something like Christmas wrapping. And the danger, even now, is that these paintings can become over-decorative, which is why I purposely try and mute them and introduce a little unpleasantness into them. Like this painting right here is an interference blue painting. And in some lights, you will see it as blue. But I call it Mississippi because it's the old muddy. It's both blue and muddy. And if not ugly color, I don't purposely try to create ugliness, but I try and damp down the over-decorative aspect of this and allow it to pop out now and then in certain lights. What I call the flash. If it were nothing but the flash, it would be flashy, and that's something that I don't really want. It's involved with light and color, especially light. So now what?
I'm struck by a few things. I want to mention one thing. I didn't at the beginning, but I mentioned, I think many of you know, that Radius is working on a book with a book of David's work, a monograph of his work, which is why I'm here. But the book was originally discussed as just starting from that moment that David was just talking about in the late 80s, early 90s, when the work shifted to this interference paint. And originally we were talking about a book that just began there and showed his work up until now, which is a remarkable body of work. But as we've talked more about the work and as I've learned more about the work, it became very clear that all of the work, starting back from the 50s and the 60s, as David said, there is a thread that runs through here that's really critical and important. And he's been talking about some amazing work, but the book will actually have images of all of that work, and we'll show you some of that work, and you'll get a sense of just how great some of that early work is and how relevant it is into where you've developed now as an artist. But what I was struck by when you were talking about this is that you kept mentioning these words that seemed to me to be very related. Light and fog and sky and water, and there is a thread through all the work, even the early work, that comes back to this concept that I think is so maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, I see all of that. I see nature in these paintings all the time. I'm not a purist abstractionist at the point where I refute that. There's a Jackson Pollock who said, "I am nature," when he asked about that. And sometimes my titles will refer to naturalistic aspects of it, and I have friends who paint monochromatically, and they refuse to put titles other than identification dates and numbers on them, which is like a license plate number to me, and I'd refute that. those, I don't want catalog numbers. I want some kind of evocative suggestion, even if you might not agree with what's evoked. But light is the most, that's the underlying content of the work, yes. And although I've spoken about it frequently in the past, I'll try and tell you what occurred to me about it, about that as a level of subject matter, even though it occurred to me long after I was dealing with light. I had first rationalized the use of light. I'll do it this way. That I'm not sure about the existence of a super creator. I'm not sure about the existence of a God. But I am sure that we are all of us a part, no matter how infinitesimally small, of the energy of the universe. And it's a cliche, but astrophysicists now say, it's now a cliche, say that every particle in our body is once part of a star, which is something that's just so amazing to me, that transcends most spiritual thought that I'm aware of. That, and it occurred to me, as it does to everybody who Einstein's famous 19.5 equation has light at one end and energy at the other. And it seems to me that light is the best expression of that energy of which we consist and of which we are part in this universe. And if nothing else happens to us, the energy of which we consist in every particle in our body is going to be recycled back into that grand, huge, incomprehensible thing that is the universe. And so this is all very highfalutin, but I think light is a wonderful thing about these interference pigments, is an expression of, in a very small way, of that kind of thing. But beyond that, I try and make something aesthetic out of it. It's not just this kind of amateur philosophizing that I'm doing that they're about. That I consider them in some ways escapist. I think of the canvases as being utopian, and these little wood panel pieces that you see, which are exhibited for the first time, and much work on paper, which I do and always have done, but which nobody ever sees, is more dystopian and more topical and more dealing with Earth. That's why I called the show Heaven and Earth, the combination of these two attitudes.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more in detail, because David's referring to the difference between most of the canvases in the show, which are more of the utopian version of light and the sort of content of his work, and then this small horizontal panel back here, of which there are a few more, and a remarkable and very large series of work on paper that you've done that relate to this work, that he refers to as more dystopian, in the sense that this is a much more activated, abstract vision, and it also, some of these go into really intense and sort of acid and hard and remarkable colors, but the play of one against the other, I think, is the way that you see them is very different and interesting.
Well, it's as if these canvases became fractured with many different colors, I guess. To give you an idea, the one in the alcove is called After the Rim Fire, but because it looks like a charred hillside. And now these paintings are surreal in that they're automatic paintings. I can't predict what's going to happen, every little shape and every little area and so on, but they do tend to begin to look like landscapes. So I called it After the Rim Fire, and in parentheses, Terrible Beauty, which is a riff on Edmund Burke's idea about the difference between the sublime and beauty, where the sublime is more awe-inspiring and a little bit scary, where beauty is more reassuring and spiritual. And these become topical in that way. They remind me of landscape and of the destruction that we're, imposing on the planet. And so they're not escapists like you could consider the canvases. And I don't refute that idea. I want people to escape from this life that we're leading that can grind us down, even if it's just a momentary little relief from reality. It's a different reality, a different level. I want to take you into a different kind of reality, and to create an alternative to what you see in the newspapers all the time and on the news, television and elsewhere. So they're utopian in that sense, and the little wood panels are dystopian. The wonderful thing about both of these kinds of paintings, and with others as well as my own, is that when I call it the Vermeer experience, when you run across a painting, either expectedly or unexpectedly in a museum, you've been trudging along, looking at a lot of dross and occasionally something that really grabs your imagination and carries you away, and you come upon a Vermeer. I don't know about you, but I have Sartori. I'm taken out of myself. It's in a different world. All of the museum fatigue disappears, all of your aches and pains, all of your thoughts. You're not unaware of people around you. The music does this more often, I think, and is a wonderful art form because of that. Not all art, not all paintings, and not all music, but it's a rare miracle when this happens. Even when it doesn't, the more ordinary works take you somewhere that is different and can be thought-provoking or give you a different outlook when you leave the museum or the gallery, or if you're living with it. Better yet, live with it. That it will affect your life over a period of time, I think. So I'll accept the term escapist in that sense. But the dystopian paintings, as I say, remark more critically on what you see around you.
That story about being in a museum and seeing a piece reminds me a little bit of the relationship that you had with Panza. Could you talk a little bit about that, about the history of that, and about, I particularly was thinking about the way, what he essentially wrote in his will about the way in which he involved your work in that process.
Panza was a wonderful man, and like most men and women, he had many different facets. He was at the same time generous and parsimonious, at the same time supportive and critical. And I remember I was with my son, who's standing in the back of the room here, in the Italian city where the Greg, what was the city? Gubbio. We were having lunch with Dr. Panza, and we were talking about various artists, and he said, "Do you like a Diebenkorn's painting?" I said, "Yeah, I knew him a little bit, and I think he had a lot of integrity." And he said, "He was not a good painter." And I said, "Well, I think he may not have been a de Kooning or as innovative as a Pollock, but I think it was at least, say, on the level of Motherwell." He said, "Motherwell was not a good painter either." So he was very opinionated in that way. But I was really happy his opinions were highly of me. He acquired more than 140 of my paintings.
For this, if you don't know about the Panza collection, it's one of the most remarkable contemporary art collections amassed, based in Italy. And Dr. Panza was hugely fond of your work, to the point that while I was saying that when he was, and you have to correct me because I don't know the details of this story, but to the point that he died recently, and when he died, in his will, it was dictated that the room for the visitation of him when he died was filled with nothing but paintings by David.
Yes, that still moves me, and I don't know how to describe it. It was in the villa in Varese, where his family had lived it was an 18th century villa. His family had lived for some long time. And his father had been knighted by Mussolini for doing something about public housing, I think, during the Depression years. And he inherited that title, and he and his brother lived in the different wings of this 130 room villa. And when he was able to, Dr. Panza bought out his brother and turned the whole villa into a public museum, which is now part of the Italian Public Trust, the equivalent of the Italian English trust that maintains properties in danger of being destroyed by
historic trust. Yeah.
And he turned what had been the dining room into a room full of my paintings. It had Franz Klein paintings in it earlier. And it was full of, five large paintings, in size larger than the square behind you there, but they were square like that. One in a big triptych form, and then two on both sides, and some smaller paintings between two windows looking out into the not an atrium, but almost. And with Renaissance furniture, and he always mixed the old and the new in that way, in a wonderful way. His art form was installation. He could in a Renaissance or Baroque palazzo, he often would juxtapose the original fresco and other paintings and ornaments along with contemporary art, and make it work as if it was all on the same level, which it is, really, and people don't realize that. And so when he died, he had all of the furniture removed, and his coffin was placed in the center of that room with just branches from the pine trees that were on the property strewn about it. The tragic thing is that hardly any Italian artist came to his funeral. So many of them were envious and criticized him for emphasizing American artists instead of Italian artists. He had a few Italian artists, one or two Germans, but mostly Americans. God bless him. And he changed my life. His collecting changed my life. And he was extremely generous with his collection. He's given away dozens and dozens of paintings to various museums. One of the most astounding things to me was that he gave the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, I don't know how many were, 40, 50, 60 pieces, including sculpture, and a large room with 5 of the biggest paintings I'd ever painted in it, the most wonderful space that my paintings have ever been in this country, matched only by a few exhibits in Europe, in the palazzi that I mentioned, the historical buildings. So I owe him a lot. The most recently, his daughter, Josephina, his wife, Giovanna, his widow, is still alive, but his daughter, Josephina, is in charge now of the foundation, and there are some 5,000 pieces in his collection in the foundation. And she's arranged to have 4 large square my paintings in the apse of a Jesuit church in Milan, which makes me nervous because they were best known for exorcism. But anyway, that's a beautiful installation.
So we don't have much time left. So on that note, I'll open it up to questions, if anybody has a question they'd like to ask.
I've stunned everybody to silence.
Did your current style just spring into your mind in 1992, was it? Or did it evolve slowly? Did you just one day start to do canvases like this?
You mean these particular kind of paintings, or the very? You're not talking about Genesis. You're talking about.
Well, but they're not monochromatic. You study them as we are sitting here, and they're not at all monochromatic.
Well, if it weren't for interference pigments, I would still be probably a relational abstractionist with various shapes and so on. As I mentioned, when I started mixing the two, it didn't work. It obviously, it was obvious to me that I was going to become not a monochrome painter, but a monopigment painter, because these colors shift. You can't call them monochrome, really. I was always, from the 1980s onward, reductive in my thinking. Essentialism is what essentialist is what the term I've used. And so it just that it became obvious that one pigment was enough. I didn't need any more. That's what I mean by essential. If I thought these paintings required more, I'd put more in them. I'm not a doctrinaire monochrome painter or reductive painter. I know artists who are, and they would think of my little works on wood panel and paper as being a traitor to the cause, to me, that's absurd. But we're also such complicated people that especially when you've lived 87 years, as I have, you aren't one thing. I try and keep these paintings separate from others, but I do a lot of different things. I draw a lot. You'd be embarrassed. I'd be embarrassed to show you some of my drawings, which are extremely conventional landscapes that look like they were done in the 19th century. When I broke my hip, I did a lot of pencil drawings. I always did draw and paint on paper, but because I could sit and draw and work on paper, I did lots and lots of work on drawings on paper. And one of the things I pursued was based on something I had learned when I was a teacher of art theory. In my art analysis course, after studying it myself, realized that the way the horizon is treated in the history of various cultures in the West is different, and it has to do with the worldview of the people at that time. For instance, in classical Chinese painting, you rarely ever see a horizon line. They're all hidden behind peaks and valleys and patches of fog, and they're implied, and very rarely is there a horizon line. And it's as if people never left their little village. Their world was circumscribed. And it was during the Quattrocento in the West, when Brunelleschi and others started developing perspective, that coincided with the exploration of the rest of the globe by the Western explorers. As people from Western Europe literally went out into the world toward the distant horizon, the space in paintings moved back and back and back and back and back. And one-point perspective and two-point perspective were developed. So I did a series of these fragments of horizon lines in the Quattrocento manner, in the Chinese manner. The Japanese painting is different than China's painting. But they too had no horizon line. The whole space was tipped up this way. It's isometric perspective. So instead of moving back and forth in space, the space moved up and down this way. Figures at the top were the same size as figures at the bottom. And again, rarely you would see the horizon line. They're always looking down at the floor like that, sort of. And so in the process of this, though, you see, this is the way my crazy mind works, I think all of our minds may work this way. One of the things I noticed is that I was doing horizon lines taken from hill ridges. And I live across the bay from Mount Tamalpais in San Francisco, which in the Ohlone language means sleeping maiden. And you can see the silhouette as if it's an elongated Giacometti painting with I'll do it backwards so you can see up at the peak, there's a little profile. And it meanders down, and toward the bottom, the feet stick up. And then about a third of the way down, you can see that she's pregnant, early pregnancy, and on down. Well, it struck me that I was doing horizon lines after horizon line and inventing them as well. And I realized that some of them began to look like human profiles. And so I started doing profiles of people whose profiles or from paintings I'd never seen. I did a profile of the Mona Lisa, for instance. Have you ever seen her in profile? No. I made a drawing of her in profile, which I think works. I think you would recognize it as the Mona Lisa, La Gioconda. Then I did one of Munch's Scream. You never see the Munch's person in Scream. It's an androgynous person. You can't tell what sex it is, but you never see that face in profile. So I did it like that. But all horizontal, because they related to the horizon line. So that's the way one thing leads to another. And as I say, I'd go crazy if I had to paint nothing but these every day, the same thing over and over again.
You get the sense of how honest his process, it's your process, but his thinking process, as he moves through things, it's very evolutionary. These are the result of 6 decades of evolutionary process. I think they're very much about that. And even though there is that kind of very important moment in the late 80s, early 90s, where it shifted in some way important, it kind of all relates to everything that came before in a very thoughtful kind of way. At least it does to me.
And of course, these horizon lines drawn from landscape were similar to what I was doing, the old stripe paintings from the 1960s. So.
Mr. Simpson, you talked about these paintings reflecting or being essences of light and energy. I know that's what I felt when I first saw them. And it seems to come through you and bounce off of us. Does that exhaust you to a point that you have to rest, regenerate, to go to the next body of work, or does it rejuvenate you?
Well, as I say, sometimes I go down to my studio in the morning and think, what in the hell have you done? But it keeps my mind alive, yes. All of these kinds of paintings do. No matter whether it's representational or not. And some series of paintings I've done in the past I will never show. I have them stored away, but for a lot of reasons, wouldn't want anybody to see them. And some of the paintings that I destroyed because I didn't want people to see them. Because I told you, I'm impulsive. Instead of doing preliminary sketches and then selecting one or two and throwing the rest away or whatever, an idea pops into my head and I do it willy-nilly. That's both an advantage and a curse.
One more.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really hearing you speak, and I guess through some of the things you touched
where the colors come from? I'm missing
Was
some of
was
this.
Was some of that work an influence on you? Was Friedrich's work or some of that? I mean, I know you've talked about Turner as an example of
Still having a
landscape problem.
I'm sorry, I'm so deaf, I can't, even with my hearing aids here, enough of what you're saying to give you a reasonable answer.
Yeah, I guess I'll try to be a little bit more clear. I think immediately of Caspar David Friedrich, Monk by the Sea, the painting.
Oh, yeah.
As I sit here and some of your ideas about the sublime and the terror and the beauty. And so I'm just wondering if you look at Caspar David Friedrich or German Romanticism at all, or if it's more
I wish I could understand it.
Have you ever been influenced by German Romanticism or by Caspar David Friedrich?
Oh,
is there an influence there in terms
The
of
Monk by the Sea. There was that wonderful book, is it Rosenberg, about the northern tradition, and he drew a distinction between the modern art as originating in Paris and French with the northern tradition, and he equated Rothko with that group, the northern group. I really believe in the importance of art history, of understanding your background and understanding your the culture from which you sprang. And I tried to teach an analysis course from that basis. But I'm not an art historian, and my gaps of knowledge are huge. I'm a practical American, and I make use of what I learn and limit what I learn to what I make use of. So I'm not a true scholar at all. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I have a very good visual memory, and I think I've been influenced by everything I see, for ill or good. And I remember now even paintings by students from 20 years ago that they did. To my horror, I remember.
One more.
I'm interested in your choice of size and proportion for these canvases.
Well, a lot of that, well, there's one general premise: the bigger the better. but aside from that, I am impulsive in a certain way. The color changes as my appetite for color changes. Right now, for the last 3 or 4 months, I've been enthused with interference green and violet. And I got into a dragon series in terms of title. I years ago painted a very large painting called Enter the Dragon. And it was interference green, fairly dark, with the opposite, the complementary color red, which is often what happens with interference green. And that triggered a whole series of dragon paintings. The dragon exit on the right. The year of the dragon, it turns out, was the year I was born, in 1928. It was the year of the dragon. So the last in the series of dragon paintings was called The Year of the Dragon. And I got sick of myself for doing that. And as I know, it's a game that people play on computers and all of that. And I was beginning to think that was just too trivial. So the next little painting I did, I called Crocodile Tears. And Serpentine. I kept the reptilian theme going. But I do like to title things like that. But the thing is, that my underlying point here is that I will get tired of the greens, and my appetite will change, and I will become enthused with other colors. The main color that I think is the most popular color with everyone now, is, according to statistics, is blue. the blues, interference blues, are my favorite colors. And I could overindulge so easily in blues. And that's one reason why I try to sort of uglify them like Mississippi here. They're so seductive. Then you'll see, they're all over the place. It's interesting that historically, blue was not always the most popular color. Red was for a long time. And it all goes back to, there's a wonderful book called Blue, about the history of blue. It all goes back to the dyeing occupation in Western Europe, where dyes were brought from the East. And red was the most popular color at that time. And the indigo trade began to introduce blue into fabrics and so on. And the red dyers fought back. And the blue fought back and convinced people that red was a symbol of the devil. And so blue became more important to people. And blue is still sometimes associated with the devil or with monsters and so on. So it's an interesting history of what favorite colors. The other thing, of course, is that our threshold of color has risen from the you could probably go back to the Quattrocento, where increasingly color became brighter and brighter and brighter until you reached the Fauves, which became, the color became so strong and arbitrary that a lot of people say that the analytical Cubists reacted against color by going to those muted grays and browns and refused to use color until Picasso rediscovered color in the 20s and became what Edgar Vin called the greatest cartoonist of the 20th century, which is not an insult.
Well, I think we'll end, just for time, we could do this for a long time, it would be great, but for time's sake, I think we're going to have to stop.
Okay.
But thank you, David, that was really great.
All right.
Thank you all for coming.
California abstract painter David Simpson has been revered as an artist and teacher in both the United States and Europe since the 1950s. From early successes, his work was included in Clement Greenberg's LA County Museum of Art's exhibition, Post-Painterly Abstraction, along with work by Morris Louis, Kenneth Nolan, and Ellsworth Kelly. To the present day, his paintings have always challenged the very basic form of painting and the possibilities of pure abstract expression. Since 1990, he has painted mostly monochromatic work that hovers in an almost alchemical realm. Using interference paints composed of titanium dioxide electronically coated with mica particles, Simpson creates nuanced, mercurial paintings on smooth and active surfaces. The particles of mica act as tiny mirrors, reflecting light back and forth in ever more complicated patterns. The results transcend the very notion of paintings as they play with the medium of light itself to create the monochromatic shift of color. David Simpson is on the Radius book list for winter 2014. David Chickey is co-owner of Skulkin & Chickey, a graphic design firm that provides a full range of design services to artists, museums, and publishers. Clients include David Zwirner Gallery, Aperture, the Lannan Foundation, Abrams, the Denver Art Museum, Rizzoli, the Peabody Museum, Site Santa Fe, Magnum Photography, and many others. He is the former board chair of the Center for Contemporary Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a graduate of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Sussex University.